All right, recording started. All right, class, welcome to another great interview. So we're fortunate enough to be joined by Steve Miles. And Steve and I have known each other since we were little kids. We grew up two houses down from each other. And, as we think about the other interviews that you've been able to listen to, this one's going to be a little bit different in terms of background. So Steve has a deep background in technology and computer science, going back to just some of our youngest times together in middle school actually, and seeing him work on a variety of projects. And you could really tell early on that Steve was really smart guy, really driven, really focused on unleashing the power of technology, learning how technology and its application could really be, useful in business and helping other human beings. So I think we're gonna have a really great conversation around things like ethics and artificial intelligence and just sort of forward-looking viewpoints around where technology is kind of going. His background isn't necessarily just data analytics. He's worked in a lot of other areas that sort of touch on data analytics. So I thought it'd be really great to get some perspective from somebody who's steeped in technology, has worked their way through technology in sort of a non, maybe traditional way, and he started up a number of very successful businesses. So we're going to get a really great entrepreneurial viewpoint through some of these questions, which I think will be a benefit to the class. So Steve, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Cool. So let's just go ahead and start. Would love to hear, just for the class about you, and if you want to talk on a little bit of the, academia experiences, professional experiences, and certainly a little bit about you personally, and we just kind of start there.
Sure. I've been interested in technology pretty much since I was able to read in any way, shape, or form. I have one parent who worked at the University of Kansas in their academic computing services department from the time I was about 5 years old, and had a lot of exposure to computers just from a visual perspective when I was really young. And when I was young, computers were huge and took up rooms. And they were really interesting to me because there was so much mystery behind what they did and how they did it. And after very little exposure to that, I was basically locked in as wanting to do something in the space, basically from the time I was very little. I was fortunate enough growing up to have a number of family members who, at that time worked in fields that were related to electrical engineering, NASA and computer science at that time, and other related things that gave me an opportunity as I got through high school and in college to get exposed to work opportunities that let me, develop those skills and, make something of it. Um, my start really probably really took off when I was in early high school and started a computer bulletin board. Back at that time, these were things where you would use a modem that was operating at speeds that would be considered ridiculously slow today, less than 1 megabit per second, actually less than about a kilobit per second when I first started. And you would dial from one computer to another, and basically do very light versions of email and online discussion boards and stuff like that. And this was in the late 80s. And as part of that, I was able to get access to the source code for the bulletin board I was running, and started tearing that down and teaching myself how to program in Pascal. And took that, developed the skills necessary to convince someone to give me a job doing that very thing. Through high school, worked that job and transitioned into being able to develop software for industrial control systems, mostly focused in the petroleum automation space, but also in food processing and some other, applications that are like manufacturing related or industrial related, some like electrical power plants and things like that. At the same time, I went to school at KU, pursued a computer engineering degree. Went there for 4 years, then got an opportunity to to actually work in the education technology space. And I did that while still working at my job in the automation space. And that took up so much of my time that I never actually finished my college career. Basically, the opportunity in the ed tech space took off, rapidly ramped from a company where I was the first employee, person number three with an employee ID. So, it was owned by two people and I was the third one brought in. And over the space of about 10 years, we grew that from 3 people into 65 and then sold it in 2009. After that, I ran a wine bar for a couple of years, and then got to work on what I'm doing today, which is working in I guess you'd call it the healthcare space, working mostly with primary care physicians, helping them understand economics of their practices, and also issues related to supply chain and practice management. So we help mostly independent primary care physicians remain independent by giving them the ability to make good decisions off of lots of numbers.
That's great. Maybe with some of these roles, especially in kind of engineering, I always think of you as an entrepreneur and an engineer. Traditionally people kind of go to academic pathways, to get some of these kind of prerequisite experiences or the academic background, based on what jobs sort of require. But obviously, really smart guy, spent a lot of time with technology, throughout your entire life. When you look at your time after high school, at KU, did some time there, didn't finish. Talk about how maybe it did help you, and then maybe talk about your, kind of looking backwards, how maybe it was or was not necessary, or maybe didn't help you as you kind of reflect.
Sure. So I think that what helped me specifically in college was exposure to classes that were not directly related to what I was studying. So I had a number of business statistic classes that I took, which are obviously very important to being able to ask the right questions and answer questions well. Um, I was exposed to, as a result of being in an engineering path, quite a bit of mathematics up through calculus 3 and differential equations. And while I don't necessarily apply a lot of that from a day-to-day basis, it certainly helped. It helped me structure the way I think about problems. I guess also there was like an algorithmic problem solving course involved in that. It was all undergraduate for me, but I would say that for the most part, what I got out of the college experience that's applicable today um, was a lot of the enough of the theoretical underpinnings of how things work to marry with the practical application, which I pretty much completely self-taught. Um, Probably the best way to say it.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. So we've touched on this with a few of the other interviews where, we kind of look at, quote unquote education, which, really is, I guess, different than academia, as being kind of like a series of on ramps and off ramps, or kind of cohabitating together, with your professional career. And I don't think that's a lot of what, college students kind of think about. They kind of think about it in a linear order, right? Like, I'm going to go get a degree, and then I'm going to get a job, and that's just kind of what I'm going to do. But in reality, I've found that consistently from some of the most successful people, including yourself, it's really kind of a walk together between education and career. And education doesn't necessarily have to mean, going and getting a certification or a credential or a degree. It can be simply being curious, which is something that, I hear from you, we've heard from others. And then also, even just reading, how do you educate yourself in a way that maybe, might be outside the academic setting. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, and maybe how you go about, doing that as a technologist.
Sure, and I think it's 100% spot on. Really, I think the best thing that you get out of you know all education is improving your ability to learn. I would say, broadly speaking, what you learn through a set educational path is much less important than developing the skills to learn throughout your life. Um, I spend a significant amount of my day still reading and learning about things that I don't understand, need to understand. The market's constantly changing, so you're constantly having to add skills and deprecate skills that you have, or rewrite skills that you have because they're no longer relevant, or the science behind what you thought was right has changed. So yeah, like on a day-to-day basis, my my work less and less involves any form of actual software development, but it actually still touches on it occasionally. And I would say I'm not tightly enough in it to by any means be considered, someone who would just say, yeah, that's the person who I want to go develop something. But I keep my skills, tight enough to be able to get it done if I need to. And, just like practically that involves like going out to some place like Stack Overflow to see how somebody has solved a problem, and then reading up and understanding how they got to that point. um, there's a lot of ongoing learning that has to occur, and I don't know if I directly answered your question, but it's kind of how I felt that was the right way to answer it. So.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think you're right. I think it's informal learning. It's not just a matter of just like kind of turning the spigot off once you start working in your jobs, right? It's actually, being intellectually curious and kind of being a voracious reader. It's not one of those deals you just kind of set to the side
Yeah,
if you want to kind of progress. Go ahead.
yeah,
Yeah.
my iPhone tells me I spend about 6.5 hours a day reading something that is ultimately something tech related. So if that gives you any idea of how much reading I actually do. So.
No, that's great. That's actually a great statistic to kind of keep in mind as you think about just what your professional day looks like actually.
Yeah.
Let's tilt gears here a little bit. And again, data analytics, certainly, I'm sure you've got a ton of thoughts around how it plays into, your work with starting businesses, your work with technology. Maybe give us your view of the current state of data analytics as it both pertains to your world and maybe just at large.
In my world specifically, data analytics is a very much a means to an end, and I'd say that what I do is maybe not data analytics in the sense it's spoken about today, but it's more analysis of large sets of data um, that are all the work is very specifically geared towards helping people make decisions about the economics of their practices. So it's pulling in lots of information, pricing information, product compatibility information, things like that. And then marrying that up against the kinds of patients that our practices have and the environments that they operate in. And, sometimes we'll pull in um, uh, demographic information to help them be sensitive to things that may affect them, say, like in the vaccine space. And then, trying to pull all of it together and then make a cohesive, picture of this is where you are and this is where you want to get. So I wouldn't say it, jumps into big data type analytics, but it has some things that are kind of like that. More broadly, obviously, data analytics is powering the entire future. I mean, when you look at the underpinnings of how AI works, I mean, it's all data analytics. And when you look at, say the state of physics today, all of it, quantum physics is effectively nothing but analytics. So, the underlying ideas for data analytics are basically what's writing our future. You can't do anything without it.
Yeah, so let's jump to the big question, which I know you have just a ton of thoughts about, and knowing you're a big Star Trek fan as well as am I. As for little kids, we saw artificial intelligence embedded in, a lot of the science fiction that we saw as kids. So in many ways, it's not necessarily a foreign concept, whether you think of, Star Trek, Star Wars, with the robots, or you think of Terminator, worst case scenario, right, with Skynet. Let's talk artificial intelligence. I know you think a lot about this. Where do you see it being most useful in the future, and where are you concerned and why?
In the short term, I think its best application is in optimization of processes. I was just reading something last week where they were talking about the fact that they had applied some machine learning techniques to monitoring electric vehicle charging approaches and helping try to make it so you can charge them faster and increase the number of charge cycles that can be done before you start having significant degradation of the packs. And one thing that AI slash machine learning, which I kind of view as one and the same. I think they pretty much are one and the same. And AI is obviously AGI is an extension of it, but at the current where we are right now, AI and ML are kind of the same deal. They were able to run thousands and thousands and thousands of iterations on a well-defined problem and ultimately come up with a solution that appears to be able to more than double the lifespan of a traditional lithium-ion pack in an electric vehicle and charge it at about 30% the rate. And that's able to be accomplished because you're able to develop models that can rapidly iterate themselves and do things that would take individual human a lifetime, a team of humans decades. You can start doing that kind of stuff in the space of months, weeks, or days, it's just incredible. Those kind of problems, I think, are what we're solving today. And when you think about the way we think, and again, getting back to the way our existence is defined physically, the ability to solve problems that way, which really it's still kind of a brute force solving, but it's an intelligent version of that, is really, really powerful. In terms of longer term concerns, obviously the biggest concern is that people can trust the output of these things without verifying it, or validating it, and that has a lot of different looks, and some of them can, they may not necessarily be hugely problematic. It just, a company may go the wrong direction and spend money in the wrong way and not be successful, but other ones can be really problematic. Some of the ones where I become concerned are, like one thing I was reading yesterday was a situation where they've used AI to basically go through a tremendous number of retinal scans, and they've been able to predict with a pretty high degree of accuracy whether or not you're likely to die prematurely of heart disease. That kind of thing, it can obviously be of tremendous help in terms of diagnosing potential issues, and helping someone's physician craft care to help work on that kind of situation. But you take that same thing and you put it in the hands of the wrong people, and it can be used to have a significantly adverse effect on the lives of the people that say are diagnosed that way. It can affect employability for people. It can affect the ability for people to be insured, things like that. So it's that there's a lot of opportunity, but a lot of risk. And those are just two examples I could think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think those are all good. And if you think about AI, maybe a little closer to home with some of the businesses that you're working with and have started, do you see any kind of, maybe you're working with some of it today in your tech stack, or do you have some kind of vision for that in your solutions or tech stacks within your businesses? And if so, maybe how might you apply it?
At this point, I wouldn't say that I have much, if any, exposure to AI in our tech stacks. There are places where I think it could be useful. We do a lot of ingestion of data that often isn't well formed, and sometimes it's coming from human sources, like handwritten documents or hand-filled PDFs, but they're filled by people, so the data is not good. And having having a well-trained machine learning application that can work on well-defined sets of data like that and produce output that is usable in mass, that will become very powerful for us. I would say the state of technology is still not there. It's really interesting because you can have a vehicle that's doing a fairly passable job of emulating a human while driving on the road for the majority of the cases, but you still have situations where being able to reliably pull handwriting off of a one-page PDF is not good enough. And it really speaks to the whole, you spend 10% of your time working on 90% of the problem, 90% of your time working on 10% of the problem. And the promises of AI, they're really high based on how quickly you can ramp on it. But to really, 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 get as good as people, that's a hard task.
Cool. When you think about sort of ethics, like we've had this conversation with a few others around, and you kind of touched on with artificial intelligence as well around the retinal scans and early identification of disease and maybe cascading impacts. The conversation around ethics. I was just reading today that there's an executive order signed by Biden that kind of establishes a common framework again between the EU and the US around data sharing, because of course there's a pretty big breach of trust, over the last, 5-10 years, whether that be, with some of the big tech giants or, even sort of, information sharing from the CIA sort of tapping into a lot of phones and computers from leaders throughout the EU. So there's a lot of challenges around the state of ethics and technology, and moving outside the range of just the AI discussion. Would just be interested to hear what you think of the state of ethics in technology, and what you think about potential best practices that people should really be considering or thinking about.
Sure. Yeah. The the move by the Biden administration, it certainly has all the looks of something that we've needed for a long time. The devil's always in the details in political matters, and yeah, as an entrepreneur for all my life, I'm definitely I very cautious before I embrace government solutions to problems, because a lot of times they might say the right words and outwardly appear to try to achieve the right means, but the devil's definitely in the details. And it's kind of like a standardization of charging cables overseas. It's one of those deals where that's great today, but it might not be great tomorrow if there's a better one. But there's 30 years of standardization that you have to overcome. So yeah, in terms of ethics around data specifically, I think that I think we've all been able to observe that there's a lot of risk associated with the enormous amounts of information that's being amassed about us, if only because of the extent to which it can instruct people how easy it is to manipulate us, and manipulate our views on things and the way that we conduct our lives. Um, I think that people, generally speaking, should be in control of their information. They should be able to give people access to their information. And in so doing, the people that they give that information to should be able to establish some terms that allow them to have ongoing access to that information if it's given to them with full understanding of why it's been given. Because for all the downsides that you have on it, there's also tremendous upsides. And if you make it impossible to get at data at scale, it's very difficult to make intelligent decisions off of information. But if you get it at scale without permission, again, you can get back and do wrong things with it pretty easily. So it's a complicated subject, and it's interesting when you talked about like the CIA CIA or NSA acquisition of data. And if you believe the reports you read, there are servers set up in the desert that are recording all of the encrypted traffic across the internet all of the time. And if you believe the other things you read, at some point we presumably will have some form of quantum quantum computing capability that can crack encryption keys trivially. And that's a hugely problematic thing if those two things are actually true. And having the guardrails to ensure that it just can't be horribly abused are important.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, kind of bringing together two worlds, right? Quantum computing, right at the edge. I was actually going to ask you next question was going to be around, some of the innovation you see coming down the pipe, in technology and quantum computing. I spent some time reading about it. Incorporated a little bit of quantum concepts into my wedding vows, actually, which you were there for. It would be really interesting to maybe hear you talk about the convergence of what you were just describing there with, hey, all this data, all this information being tracked and recorded on the internet, and then what that really means when you think about the coming age of quantum computing.
That's a tough question. Um, I would say that in my mind, the jury's out as to whether or not we will ever have a practical general quantum computer. I think that the writing is on the wall that we're at least going to be able to have special cases that are solved by specially built quantum computers. But there are a lot of situations where something that someone has solved in a quote quantum way has subsequently been solved in a more traditional way with equal performance. So it's a very difficult problem. There's a lot of money being thrown at it, and I'm always optimistic that when we find something we think we can do, we'll figure out a way to do it. But I'd say the jury's still out in terms of the intersection of those kind of things. I mean, if you can build a computer that can effectively do something like crack a cryptographic key that currently would take longer than the heat death of the universe to achieve, and do it in, I don't know, seconds, minutes, hours, days, it doesn't really matter. I mean, on a human timeline, the rate at which we can advance anything, if that is a generalized capability, it's incomprehensible. I mean, you've looked at like a basically like a 10-year time frame roughly since Google, through what is now called Waymo, came out and said that self-driving technology was 5 years away, and none of us were going to have to drive our cars again. And we're probably still a bare minimum of 5 years away from that starting to be a reality in most cases, probably more realistically about 10. But if you actually had, generalized quantum computing available that could take in all of the data sets that are available to solve that problem, right, you may be able to train it as much time as it takes to train a 14-year-old to drive. And once you've done that once, you can apply it to the entire fleet. and that's not even getting into the concepts of what ultimately dictates what makes us conscious. But I kind of have the personal belief that it's the ability to very rapidly do probabilistic solving, and that's the kind of thing a quantum computer can do very well. And you definitely are going to want to have some good guardrails on that kind of technology before you start unleashing it. That's probably the best thing I can say about it. But there's a lot of prognosticating there that's very difficult to do.
Gotcha. When you think about technology and just sort of maybe the three or four coming innovations or edge innovations that get you the most excited, what are they?
Well, I've talked about self-driving vehicles several times. I think autonomous vehicles is a big one. It has a lot of application that, for one thing, can give mobility to a lot of people that don't have it. We have an aging population, and if that technology matures on a reasonable timeline, you may be able to add 10 or 15 years of quality living for a lot of people that otherwise, as they get older, they get shut into their homes, they're less mobile, and can't enjoy the kind of retirement that they wanted. At the other end of the spectrum, you give the ability for young people. I have a child who will be of driving age soon, and lots of people do. to be able to be mobile, but maybe not be mobile in a way that's quite so risky before they're old enough to have a better understanding of the risks that they pose to themselves and them around them when they get behind the wheel. And then, you just have everybody in the middle, which is everybody's just kind of an average driver, and everybody's a bad driver at some point, and everybody's probably a reasonable driver most of the time. But if you can take all those times when you're really not being all that attentive and you really don't want to be driving and just have it be done for you. We have 50,000 people a year that die on the road, and just that one little development can save a lot of lives and make a lot of things better. That's one that comes to mind. There are obviously many others.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good one. We've had that brought up, a number of times as sort of the work that's been done there, which has really been, over many years, and just kind of how much money's been thrown at it, how many companies are doing it, kind of the state of where we are. And to your point, like, how far away are we from kind of mass adoption, that kind of opportunity, that kind of solution, in the next decade. You're probably right. It's, we'll keep making incremental gains. But, really, this is a long process, especially when you think about, some of the legislative and rule-based implications that have to come from society that really hasn't had to be considered yet either. So we'll see kind of fits and starts, to that process. But, truly, whether you're talking about drones, whether you're talking about cars, whether you're talking about trucking, there's just massive implications, not only in terms of, the people who generally are, participating either as drivers, paid or not, to just kind of transforming transportation. I was just reading about kind of last mile transportation in, big cities like New York or Los Angeles, where they're testing out, a lot of these, kind of like, people carrying drones that are really intended to kind of replace, taxis, and, have ranges that can get people, 20, 25 miles, out, and how that just like truly transforms the landscape of a city. But all that's
Sure.
dependent upon, engineering and technology, and certainly data analytics, and, advanced algorithms that communicate together and work together, and, improve both, kind of human survivability, how long people live, longevity, but also quality of life, right? So just tons of implications there. I think it's a great one to talk about.
Absolutely.
When we think about, just kind of turning back to students here a little bit, I'd really be interested in your thoughts around what you look for when you're hiring people. So, we've got a lot of freshmen, sophomore, folks in this class. The next few years, presumably, they're going to be looking for, internships. They'll be looking for their first, probably real professional opportunity. What do you look for when you're recruiting and hiring?
The number one thing that I look for is a strong desire to be doing what they're applying for. Um, it's interesting because I've probably interviewed about 500 people for mostly software development related jobs over the last 15 or 20 years, and I've always been surprised by the number of people who are applying for a job because it's what they went to school for, but not applying for a job because it's what they want to be doing. And I obviously, if I hire somebody, I want them to be successful, and I want them to be a member of my team, and I want them to be a happy and productive member of my team. And I think it's really difficult for someone to do that if their heart's not in it and their mind's not in it. And the realities of life are that sometimes you have to do something that you don't even necessarily want to do just to get to where you want to be. But more broadly speaking, when I'm trying to hire somebody, what I really try to determine is, does this person have a active interest in what they're going to be doing, some form of a passion for some aspect of the job that they're going to be doing. It doesn't have to be all of it, but some passion for some aspect of it, and then the work ethic to actually do it. Those combination of things, they trump any level of education for me. You obviously have to have somebody who is confident enough to be able to effectively communicate with a team, interact with a team, be part of a team. And you have to have someone who has the technical baseline to be able to understand what they're doing. But I would take a talented enough but relatively unqualified candidate over a supremely qualified candidate that just seems to be there to get the job but not actually do something with it every day. I really look for people who I think want to be doing what they're doing is probably the best way to say that.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, it's an interesting point, right? We've had seen all the articles here in the last 3 years, around, sort of high schools and college enrollments and college graduation rates, people taking gap years, a lot of people with degrees going out there in the world and not necessarily finding a job that, is related to the field that they, kind of studied or attempted to study, and, either finding maybe that's not what they wanted to do, or not sort of the right compensation, and just kind of how that's been impactful in terms of how people kind of see more advanced education opportunities. So I think when I think about this, I kind of think about how you and I were kind of raised in Lawrence, which is a pretty liberal town. University of Kansas is there, kind of looming, big looming shadow, Rock Chalk Jayhawk. We're really fortunate to grow up in that environment where we had good schools, and we had higher education, kind of embedded in our lives all the time. But at the same time, we had this expectations as kind of middle income, kind of bracket younger folks, that we had to work, and the expectation was to work. And you see this really important blending, I think, of people who start to work at a young age. They understand the importance of education, and that they kind of go hand in hand, and that they need to be valued, one way or another, if you're going to kind of move forward and be impactful. And I think the one thing that we probably don't talk enough about, is maybe the gaps around, maybe younger generations and, work ethic, and really needing to make sure that they understand that when you go out into the workplace, whenever that is, yeah, you got to find the thing that you're interested in doing, something that you are willing to put effort into, and then understand that your effort is really oftentimes the delta around why you're going to be successful or not.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think there's any like generational issue with work ethic. A lot of people like to make a big deal about that, but that's been going on since the beginning of time. I mean, every single generation bemoans the one that follows it, and I don't necessarily think that's a valid criticism that people try to loft. I think probably what's a little bit or lodge. I think probably what's a little bit different right now is the workforce, the work environment, and the world of work is changing so rapidly that it's really difficult for our young people to have a very high level of confidence that anything that they study with a vocational intent um, is going to be applicable long term, and it makes it really hard to invest a lot of time and energy into really truly understanding and mastering something when you're not sure that it's even going to be relevant 5 years from now. And that's something that you and I had to deal with it a little bit because we kind of entered the workforce right around the time that the internet boom started. But it's done nothing but speed up and speed up and speed up. And our parents, they had to deal with it in a little bit of a different way, but there are lots of situations where people that are slightly older than you and I, Nate, they were able to have a single career for their entire life, and that was the way that it was. And I think for most people that are your and my age, we're probably going to go through 3, 4, maybe 5 careers, quote careers, through our working lives. And I think that young people, I mean, they may be in a situation where the idea of a career is not even the same thing that you and I consider it because of the speed at which those things are changing. Again, going back to the generic artificial intelligence. I mean, you can unseat entire classes of work very rapidly with that kind of deal, and I think people are smart enough to recognize that. But there are plenty of things that young people are interested in and have a passion for, and going back to it, it's you have to have a good education that's broad enough to teach you how to be a good learner, so that as those changes happen, you can move with it. And I think the work ethic is there. It's just finding the work to do.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and you use the word passion, and it's kind of interesting. I was kind of reading a recent article from Mark Cuban around what he kind of recommended to people who are looking to change careers, looking for the job, and he said, we use a lot of extreme words, in our kind of American lexicon these days for whatever reason, and passionate, and we got to find these passions. And he said, that's actually probably like the last thing that you might recommend to younger people. He said he offered, I thought, a pretty interesting, more subtle way to think about where you should discover yourself or discover what you might be interested in. That's actually to look at where you put your actual effort, as opposed to what you sort of think about passions, but more, you will naturally kind of push effort where you have interests, right? Where you have natural interests. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting way to paint the picture around um, career or job or interests, is around just sort of being self-aware of maybe where you put your energy on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to kind of this really extreme idea of like, I got to find my passion and I just got to do my
No, yeah,
passion, right?
I
Yeah.
totally agree. I mean, you can't really create a passion. You can't really develop a passion. I mean, and not everybody has a passion. I mean, there are plenty of people that don't have a passion in the traditional sense, and there's nothing wrong with that. And you're probably saying it in a really good way, and he probably said it in a good way, which is cultivating things that you're interested in, and you may or may not be like emotionally passionate about it. But most people do tend to elect to spend their days certain ways and elect to spend the time that they're thinking about things certain ways, and identifying those things within yourself, and then amplifying those as necessary to achieve whatever form of success that you want. And even the definition of success is changing over time. You and I have talked about it a lot. The boomers, which we're children of, their success was all measured in the amount of things they could cram into their living rooms. And
Yeah.
you and I don't necessarily view it that way. I mean, we're probably a little bit of a hybrid, but I know a lot of younger people do not look at it that way at all. A lot of younger people are, they don't even want to own a car if they don't have to, and I totally get it. I could see a future for myself where I live in a larger city, and the first thing I would do is get rid of my car if I could. So yeah, it changes over time, and understanding your values and what makes you tick inside is really important to being satisfied with what you do for your life. And that's really what's the most important deal. And it's like, if you really like data analytics, and it's what floats your boat, and it's what makes you happy to think about all day long, you're going to be in a really good spot.
Yeah.
Especially if you're studying it right now and you're going well. But everybody has a different definition of happy, and that's ultimately the goal.
Yeah, define success on your terms, I think is a great way to think about it. Which, before, I think every generation would love to be able to say, like, I define success in my own terms. But given all the options that people have these days, like, I think there's never been a time in life, at least in America, where people, did have a better chance to do that. So,
Yeah.
when you think about, kind of last question, maybe last two questions for you real quick, is there any technology book that you would recommend to the students?
That's an interesting one. Even though I spend a ton of time reading, I mean, I don't spend a lot of time reading actual long form books. It's lots of articles, quite a few studies, things like that. In terms of actual books, it's actually been a long time. I think you probably know my favorite book, and it's still my favorite book today, is A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. And it gives you the ability, reading that book, it really helps, push you back and think about like underlying truths of our existence, and a lot of assumptions that we make about our existence that aren't necessarily supported by fact. And again, it comes down to, the universe works probabilistically, and applicable to this conversation. So does data analytics quite a bit. So it's
Yeah.
I think it's a good general read. And if anybody's asking me like, what book have I ever read that I think somebody should read, that is probably it. Yeah,
Cool.
I don't necessarily think I have any domain specific books I can recommend though.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. So, any final or parting thoughts for students as we wrap up the interview here?
No, I other than that, you know, you should define success on your own terms. And as long as you define success on your own terms and then pursue it, you're going to be in a good spot.
Awesome. Steve and Miles, thank you so much for giving us time and wisdom today.
Yeah, thank you.